Good evening, and thanks for joining us for the next hour. I'm Melissa Harris Perry. Rachel has the night off. Now, if you were watching the Republican Party's foreign policy debate in Washington last night, then you may have caught what happened at the very end of the evening. The last question of the night was, which national security issue do you wish we'd asked you about? What's the thing that worries you the most that hasn't been discussed tonight? And the responses given by the candidates to that question were sort of weird. Rick Perry, for instance, really wanted to talk about the pressing issue of abortions in China. Newt Gingrich wanted to talk about the dangers of electromagnetic pulse attacks. Herman Cain wanted to discuss his former career as a ballistics analyst. Who knew? And Mitt Romney and Rick Santorum both wanted to talk about the prospect of radical Islamists invading Latin America. We sort of found those answers a little puzzling, because if you'd asked us that question, there are all sorts of foreign policy issues that we here at the Maddow Show would have had on the agenda that weren't even touched during last night's debate. Things like the current debt crisis in Europe, which threatens to undermine our economic security, the deposing of the president of Yemen and how that might impact our counter-terror efforts in that region, or how about the 100 U.S. combat troops that President Obama just deployed to Africa. Instead of wanting to talk about those issues, this group of Republican presidential candidates appeared to want to focus their night on things like radical Islamists invading Mexico and, of course, pressing issues like this one.
The most significant threat is, of course, Iran becoming nuclear.
Our interest is to ensure that Iran does not go nuclear.
Iran has announced they plan to strike Israel.
When you talk about attacking Iran, it is a very mountainous region.
We need a strategy of defeating and replacing the current Iranian regime. We could break the Iranian regime, I think, within a year.
The right course in America is to stand up to Iran.
Last night, it was all Iran all the time for the Republican presidential field. It was basically a battle among the Republican candidates about who could sound tougher about the dangers of Iran and who would be best at defeating Iran. This singular focus on taking out Iran, on getting the United States involved in yet another conflict in the Middle East, was sort of a notable takeaway from last night's debate. And it didn't really make much sense until you realized who was in the crowd that they were speaking to. Now, previous Republican debates this year have featured crowds filled with likely Republican voters and Tea Party activists and conservative movement activists. And last night it was a little bit different. Last night it was guys like this who were asking the question.
My name is Paul Wolfowitz. I'm a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute.
Yes, that would be former George W. Bush Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz, otherwise known as one of the guys that brought us the war in Iraq. Paul Wolfowitz, before becoming a Republican debate questioner, was the guy who said the United States could do Iraq with a small U.S. force, that we'd be greeted as the liberators, and that the whole thing wouldn't cost us a dime. But yet, there he was last night, grilling the Republican field on matters of foreign policy. And Paul Wolfowitz wasn't alone.
I'm David Addington. I'm a vice president with the Heritage Foundation.
If the name David Addington sounds familiar to you, it's because his old job was legal counsel to Chief of Staff of former Vice President Dick Cheney. David Addington was essentially Dick Cheney's Dick Cheney. He was the mysterious, shadowy guy behind the scenes in the Bush administration who was advocating that things like torture were actually legal and that the executive branch had the power to basically do anything that it wanted in the name of national security. Like Paul Wolfowitz, though, there's David Addington front and center at last night's Republican debate, picked by CNN to scrutinize the Republican field on foreign policy, since he has so distinguished himself in that field. Also featured prominently during last night's debate was famed Bush administration-era neoconservative Fred Kagan, one of the driving intellectual forces behind the U.S. war in Iraq. And following Mr. Kagan a little bit later in the night was former Bush administration speechwriter Mark Thiessen. Mr. Thiessen has spent most of his time post-White House defending the Bush administration's interrogation policies. So last night was like a reunion of George W. Bush neoconservative foreign policy team members. If those are the guys who are still setting the agenda in the Republican Party when it comes to foreign policy, you apparently end up with getting Republican presidential candidates who sound like this.
This is one thing we know about Barack Obama. He has essentially handed over our interrogation of terrorists to the ACLU.
Senator Santorum, under certain circumstances in the past, you've supported
profiling. Is that correct?
I have. Obviously, Muslims would be someone you'd look at. Absolutely.
We need a strategy of defeating and replacing the current Iranian regime with minimum use of force.
The right course in America is to stand up to Iran.
If we were serious, we could break the Iranian regime, I think, within a year.
If we're serious about Iran, then we have to be serious about Syria as well.
This is the time for us to use not only sanctions, but covert actions within Syria to get regime change there. President Obama apologizes for America. It is time for us to be strong as a nation.
I guess this is sort of like when you put Republican candidates in front of guys like Pat Robertson and they all stop weeping about finding Jesus. Maybe this is just how Republicans react when you put them in front of Paul Wolfowitz, George W. Bush's former speechwriter, and Dick Cheney's secret lawyer. Joining us now is the Atlantic Magazine's Washington editor-at-large, Steve Clemons. And Steve also writes the blog, The Washington Note. He's a senior fellow at the New American Foundation. Thanks for joining us tonight, Steve.
Good to be with you, Melissa.
So this was a fascinating moment. And, for all the invocations of Ronald Reagan that we've, heard in these Republican debates, we have really rarely ever heard the name George W. Bush invoked. And yet when you listen last night to those Republican candidates, it sure sounded to me like George W. Bush foreign policy strategy. Of course, with the exception of Ron Paul. Did you hear a return to a neocon vision last night?
Well, actually, I think you called it exactly right. To see David Addington, who, his name does not appear in Bob Woodward's book, Bush at War, because he never wanted to be known. He wanted to be in the shadows, and until Jane Mayer's book, The Dark Side, America didn't know this guy. To walk out and see him in the cameras was amazing. These were the people who hatched and were the architects of the Iraq War on the whole. And when you look on that stage, as you said, Ron Paul is different. I'd also say John Huntsman is a bit different. But the Henry Kissinger, the Richard Lugar, the Chuck Hagel wing of the Republican foreign policy establishment is basically an endangered species. And what you've seen is the neocons, though I think essentially failing in some of their policies, have nonetheless done a brilliant job of taking over and of being very, very strong in the major think tank institutions in Washington, D.C. And that is the crowd that basically sets the terms, if you will, for foreign policy debates now.
So you're framing this as a kind of lack within the current Republican Party of this particular sort of Republican statesman model that we've once seen. So does this mean that there is a real ideological commitment to the sort of neoconservative foreign policy values on behalf of these Republican candidates? Or is this just kind of a fear tactic that's employed in the context of a campaign? In other words, should I be actually afraid, or should I just be irritated by this?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, the fact is that old-style Nixonian realism was about measuring costs and benefits to the country and to the national interest before taking action. We're in an age where anger and sentiment and trying to do good and striking back are now the terms that drive foreign policy. And so what you see is a little bit of fear-mongering that we learned from Dick Cheney works well in the political playbook, combined with what I think is something happening in both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, is a sense that you have to change the way that the inside workings of other states operate if they are seen to be a threat to the United States. It's sort of like the Borg in Star Trek. You either assimilate them or you annihilate them.
So let me ask the question that was asked to the candidates at the end. Let me ask it of you. What wasn't discussed last night as we talk about our foreign policy and national security that you think is of critical importance? Is it the European debt crisis? Is it the situation in Yemen? What should we be talking about here?
There should be an organized hierarchy. All of these issues matter. The drought in Africa matters. The European debt crisis could be a devastating blow to the global economy and really shrink America's ambitions in the world. Fundamentally, the largest national security issue out there, I think, for the United States today is the profound doubt in America's abilities to achieve the things it says it's going to do. That perception by other countries translates into weakness. Allies behave differently, foes behave differently, and so you need a serious discussion about how you creatively approach the world and opportunities and try to figure out a way to build momentum and reinvent American leadership and leverage in the world. And we didn't hear that. We heard assertions of American power, right. And we heard Mitt Romney and others basically saying we needed to kind of be bold. But this is not a recipe for a return to American leadership in the world. So whether it's China, Europe, Africa, what's happening in the global economy. It needs to fit within a plan and an equation for America to reinvent its place.
Steve Clemons, the Atlantic Magazine's Washington editor-at-large. I appreciate you sort of taking us to this place of reminding us what a big foreign policy looks like.
Thank you, Melissa.